Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you, Sketch, Sylvain, and Ellen, and everybody here. And Malaika, thank you very much for coming as my guest to talk to me about my favorite subject, music for architecture, and hopefully maybe something that you're interested in as well. I don't know what direction the conversation might go, but we're going to play some music and some visuals, which a lot of them haven't been seen before. I work a lot with my brother, David Adjaye, the architect, the award-winning architect, and in fact, all the projects on my new album, Dialogues, is a conversation with David about 10 specific projects that we've collaborated on over the last 10 to 15 years. They're all very different. Some of them are houses, some of them are pavilions, some of them are museums, so they range. But to introduce myself, Peter Adjaye, I'm a composer, sound designer, conceptual artist, involved in sounds and design for the last 25 years. And I've just released a new album called Dialogues on Vinyl Factory Records, which the Spaces is very associated with. And we've done 300 copies of a vinyl-only record, and they're available now. I'll say at the end. Okay, so music and architecture. Before I introduce Malaika, I just wanted to say that it's an area that we're both very interested in, and it's an area that Malaika, we've had many discussions, many meetings over the years, and we feel it's an unexplored area, and it's something that people aren't quite sure what it means, or at the same time, it seems to be quite an obvious connection, but how you actually manifests itself. Definitely one of those ways is this album. I wanted to say that there is many connections and differences between music and architecture, but I guess there's a mathematical connection between architecture and music in terms of structure and form, the mathematics of music and the mathematics of architecture, but there's also an aesthetic which is more about the immersive experience, the feeling that both architecture and music can give you. And I think that's something that I'm very interested in. I am actually a mathematician as well. I've got a degree in mathematics, just to put it on top.
PhD, isn't it?
It's a PhD, yeah. But I was a nerd, yeah. And I think that's what it takes, really, just hours of really being into what you're into. But mathematics and music, it seems like a natural fit to me. I don't know why people don't talk about mathematics and music, but I know most musicians would testify that music is very much about patterns and repetition and loops and shapes, and actually you think quite mathematically. It's kind of certain scales and modes. It's all pretty much mathematics in a sort of abstract form. So people that tend to be quite good at maths tend to be quite good at music, actually. And actually you'll find a lot of artists, architects and painters have a very strong association with music that they don't talk about, but I think they should talk about. I know David, my brother, when he's designing buildings, he's always listening to music. And I know his friend Chris Afili, again, he's infatuated with music, and when he's making his pieces, he's always listening to music. And the music takes them somewhere and allows them to think in that abstract way. So, Malaika, I'd like to introduce you as well.
Hello. So what I think is so interesting about this project is that the relationship between music and architecture has been very underexplored. It's not something that's never been touched on before, but architecture and sound are so completely intertwined. The sounds of a piece of music are shaped by their surroundings. But also, for me, what really interests me is that buildings are, at their best, at their most successful to me, are experiences. They offer you a journey. They elicit a feeling in you. And I think that music can play a very big part in that, as can art. So it's really exciting to bring the two together. I think you're going to start by playing us a couple of tracks, aren't you?
Yes, so I'm going to start with one of the first projects I did with David. It's called the Asymmetric Chamber, and we'll talk a bit about it afterwards.
So this one started with a sketch, didn't it? David
Yes.
showed you a sketch of the pavilion, of what he wanted to create. And how did you interpret that?
So he drew quite an abstract sketch, it seemed like, of the journey through the space. He wanted to create an immersive experience. And the interpretation was that I took it away, took it to my studio, and I looked at the materials. He gave me a section of the materials. The materials are very rough, very recycled materials that he wanted to use. And he also gave me the dimensions and the spaces. So it's an asymmetric chamber, and it has three sections, a sort of entrance, which rises as you walk up, and then a middle section, which is on the level, and then an exit where you go downwards. So it's a kind of a journey through a box, but through three different sections. He hates it when I say box, actually, so a journey through a bit of architecture. But the idea, the music was trying to follow that journey, that kind of rising strings pattern at the beginning, and also that kind of rough sound at the beginning is kind of trying to recreate the sound of the wood, because I use a Japanese instrument called a koto, and the sound of the koto is very woody, and it kind of reminded me of the kind of wood he was using. And so the strings kind of give a kind of a soundtrack kind of anticipation as you rise up, and then the center space is very energetic with the bass and the drums, and then the kind of exit is a kind of pizzicato violins as you and the kettle drums as you come down out of the space. So it's a journey through that space, and it's called Echoes because it's an echo of that space. It's an imprint of that space.
And when we spoke about the project a long time ago, David told me that he was actually a DJ first, and that you pinched his record collection. Was music a very big part of your kind of youth, and how did it all get started for you?
Lots of music in the house, and David's my older brother, and I have another older brother as well, and they all used to play music, and I was the younger guy, so I used to just observe what they were doing. And David was a DJ in the 80s for a split second, and as I always say, the best records are probably your dad's records or your brother's records, because it's that kind of personal selection. It's I'm a vinyl addict, basically. Surprise, surprise. And I have lots of records. I collect records and I use records, and I DJ a lot all around the world. I was signed to a label called Mowax back in the 90s. We toured with DJ Shadow, DJ Crush. We were kind of instrumental in this kind of trip-hop thing with Massive Attack, Portishead. So I've always been into music. I've always DJ'd, but it started off by taking my brother's records, but he wasn't a very good DJ. I think he was carrying the speakers. Architecture.
So this project started with a sketch, but how have the other collaborations worked? Does he brief you? Does he tell you that he'd like a certain sound, or does he allow you to completely have your own response to a building?
Well, some of the buildings that I've written sound scores for, like the Dirty House or Electra House that he's made, he didn't brief me. I actually, I kind of discovered some videos he'd made of the buildings, and I made a soundtrack to them. And then the pavilions, like the Asymmetric, but I've done several, including Genesis Pavilion, Horizon Pavilion. He asked me specifically to make a soundscape for those pieces. So Asymmetric is a piece of architecture with sound which travels around the world. It's in South Africa right now. It started in Manchester, the Cube Gallery, then he went to Maastricht, then he went to South Africa, and it folds up, and then it goes around the world. Horizon, another pavilion we did at the Albion Gallery 8 years ago, is now in Chicago, at the Art Institute of Chicago. And again, the sound is an intrinsic part of it. Briefing-wise, some of the projects, he tells me what his kind of main idea is, his main concept. Things that he maybe wouldn't tell anybody else, because it's that kind of, trust between artists about what he's trying to achieve beyond the brief. So, the Asymmetric was a drawing. Horizon was about an image that he took a picture of the River Galilee, and it's a journey to this picture. So he spoke about making a piece of music about silence. And then that stopped me in my tracks. I didn't quite know what to do with that. It took me a while to realize he was talking about the feelings associated with silence, and the idea that actually there is no such thing as silence, which is the kind of John Cage piece, the 433, where we talk about the idea that, that there's always a background sound, isn't there? So sound is a very pervasive thing. It's something where my favorite phrase is, you can't close your ears, but you can close your eyes. So sound is all around, it's very immersive, and it's a little bit dangerous because you can't stop it. If you're scared of a horror movie, you can close your eyes, but you're still going to get the sound coming at you. So silence, I made a very meditative track for Horizon, very meditative track, and that was the point, really. It was supposed to be something peaceful. That's what he meant by silence. So interpretations are it's art. It's abstract. I think of myself. I basically respond to visuals. I love paintings and arts and architecture, and I think David actually. We talked about this. You interviewed him. I think he responds to sound a lot, but I'm inspired by architecture or visuals or paintings, things like that. So if you give me a film, I'll make a sound score for it. If you give me a piece of wood, I'll make a sound score for it. If you give me a pavilion or a building, I'll make a sound score for it. And it's intrinsic and bespoke to that house or that pavilion. It's to do with the dimensions. The materials are very important. The dimensions are very important. And the feeling, ultimately. It's bringing a feeling to buildings, something that people don't talk about. Something I call emotional architecture. Yeah.
Do you think every building has its own intrinsic soundtrack or a piece of music that could be written for it?
Well, I think it's definitely open to interpretation. I think if I wrote a piece, maybe somebody else would write a different piece, which is fair enough. I think that's the beauty of art and music. But I certainly would love to write a soundtrack for a lot of buildings that I love, a lot of structures that I love. It comes easy to me. I think what that first project did for me, it showed me that I could easily respond to a drawing. And it took me 24 hours to put that piece together. And then I came back to Dave and he said, yeah, that's it. And he used to say to me, I wasn't sure what you were doing. I didn't know if it would work. But now every time I think of that piece, I can't imagine any other soundtrack to it. So it does become an imprint after a while because it's played inside of it. It becomes, together.
Yeah. And he said to me that he was almost spooked by what you came up with because it was so fitting for what was in his head. Has that sort of manifested itself in other projects as well, like that same sort of experience?
I think it's by the force of the fact that I've put my music there. He can't get away from it. But I think for him, he finds it a really interesting experiment to throw these ideas and then to see what I respond with. Sometimes without too much influence, but he gives me architectural drawings, he gives me the concept, he gives me the sort of materials. And I think for him, it's exciting other parts, another extension of what he does to give it another life, I guess, which he hadn't thought about, but then it becomes part of his imagination. So it's quite fun, really, to experiment.
Should we play another track?
Yes. So this is the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo, where David asked me to do a soundscape that would last for 10 years, and it's just been recommissioned for another 50 years.
Do you think we should explain the space a little bit?
Yeah, maybe before I go into it.
Yeah.
Yeah? So David was asked to design the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo for the 100th anniversary for the 100th winner of the Nobel Prize, which happened to be won by the first African woman called Wangari Maathai. And she passed away, actually, unfortunately, about 4 years ago. A Kenyan woman, very inspirational, amazing woman. And for the 100th year, he was asked to take a building that he couldn't actually change the outside of the building. He could only touch the inside because it was a listed building. And he had to create a museum that had no artifacts. There are no statues or things to show for the Nobel. It's all information. It's about who won. It's whether it's Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or whoever won. But there isn't actually anything to show. So he created a museum using data. And how he did that was by using electronics and by using artists, collaborating with different artists in different spaces to create different atmospheres, basically. And the atmosphere or the main space was called the Nobel Field. And what he did there, he had 100 pods for every winner, and he had different LEDs in the space. It looked like an indoor electronic garden. And we had 18 speakers in there, and I had a soundscape in there, which worked with the lights. As you approached each pod, the information about each winner came up. And you had this really ambient, beautiful space. So actually the film goes through the whole space, and then it eventually gets to the Nobel Field, and then it comes out. It's It's a little bit long. I might shorten it, but it's about 8 minutes.
Am I right in thinking that that one was actually the soundscape was kind of interactive within the space when it's played inside the space, or did I make that up?
No, it's probably one of the few places where you do a soundscape and then you go away and they actually keep it playing when you leave. A lot of museums, you do a soundscape and you go away, the next day they turn it right down. It's a permanent installation, it's part of the space, and as you approach each Nobel winner, the sound starts to emanate, and the more people there are in the space, each one's got a sensor, and more sounds starts to cascade and interact with the light in sort of droplets, clusters, waves. All sounds are associated with those movements as well as the light. And it was commissioned 2005, and they renewed it again. David just revamped it, and it's going to be now there for another 50 years. So it's completely immersive. It completely envelops you, and it's totally interactive. But actually, funny enough, the pads as well, the kind of iPads, basically David designed those and had those there before iPads came out. So all the kids used to go there and press the screen, but there was no interaction yet. But yeah.
Do you think that architecture writing and criticism has become overly obsessed with the visual? And is this project and this collaboration with David a kind of antidote to that, a way of changing that?
I think definitely the arts in general and architecture has always been about the visual, from the drawings, the 3D elaborations and things like and that aspect. And I think architects are very visual people, and that's where they come from. And I think David to have a sort of, his right arm, myself, his brother, who can bring those drawings to life and start to get them to have an emotion, to start moving. I mean, those visuals start to make architecture have a kind of movement, which, I think it's a very interesting time. I think it's about immersive spaces that are more than just architecture's immersive, but sound is also immersive, and that's where they're brothers.
Yeah, and his buildings are often, they've got a kind of very strong narrative to them, haven't they, in the way that he designs them. So it seems quite natural that music should fit within that.
He makes it very easy because he has a very strong idea about the reasoning behind a very kind of, strong narrative, a story behind it. And places like the Stephen Lawrence Center, which he designed, and the Bernie Grant Center, the narrative is already written. So I wrote a soundtrack for the Stephen Lawrence Center, and that was very easy. It's called Reflections of a Golden Dream, and it's about a young man's dream to be an architect. Stephen Lawrence wanted to be an architect, and David designed this beautiful building in Deptford, which is all about honouring that space, honouring that dream.
Which other musicians from the past or from the present do you think have brought these two areas together, have brought together architecture and sound in interesting ways?
Not loads, but somebody that I'm quite interested in. I don't know if anybody knows about this guy, but there's a guy called Ioannis Zanikis, who was an architect who worked with Le Corbusier, and he was involved in something called the Philips Pavilion in Brussels in 1958 at the World Fair. And he was an architect and a composer, equally as strong. And I think he definitely has that connection between architecture and music. But yeah, I don't think there are many. Do you have any examples yourself, or?
I mean, there are one artist who springs to mind is Bill Viola, who actually did quite a lot of recordings inside different buildings, but he did something in an empty swimming pool in the 1970s. And actually the Vinyl Factory put on an exhibition recently where they staged that soundscape inside the Brewer Street car park. And it was really interesting to hear the sounds that he'd created in this swimming pool, then transplanted into this concrete shell. It was really beautiful.
I mean, I must admit that, in truth, sound and architecture, a lot of music has come from different spaces. Punk notoriously was all about small spaces, very tiny clubs with low ceilings, and that kind of helped create the sound because it was people were right in each other's faces. So I guess architecture and music have always been working together, really. In terms of the arts, there's a few examples. I'm very much into classical music. That's probably why I quoted Zanikis, because he's a classical composer. But there are a lot of genres of music are about the spaces they're created in, whether it's grime music or hip hop music. It's the space, it's the kind of enclosure. It's London, it's the melting pot, and the council estate meets the East London art world. So. Yeah, I think sounds and architecture have always collided.
Should we play one more track?
One more track, okay. So this one is Dirty House in East London, a house that David built quite a while ago, I think 15 years ago. One of the first kind of outhouses in Shoreditch, and before Shoreditch got so trendy. And it belonged to two artists. I did a soundtrack for it. It's quite, yeah, have a listen.
you get quite a sense of two different personalities coming through with that track. So it starts off quite eerie, and then there's a definite switch in tone. Can you tell us about why that is? What inspired that?
I call it musical duality. It's about the building having the halo at the top and having that dark exterior. When you see that building, you think it's quite foreboding. And then when you go into the space, it's all light and white and airy and high ceilings. And the actual residents, the downstairs is their studio, and at the top, they live at the top. So from the outside, it's got anti-graffiti paint. It's black. It's sort of, don't come near us. Inside, it's fun. It's white. It's playful. So yeah, that's kind of the music playing with that.
And do you think about the personalities of the people that are going to live in the house when you do something like that?
Definitely, because I know Tim and Sue very well. So yes, there had to be that kind of dark and light.
And is music for architecture going to be a continuing journey? Do you see it turning into a whole sort of genre? Do you see it, or will you keep the collaboration with David going? Where do you see this going?
I already have a few other projects that I've written that I want to document, so I'm going to definitely bring those out. And I've got some more projects coming up. I'm doing some work with a speaker company where I'm designing a soundtrack for their speaker, which is going to be made out of concrete. And I'm doing something in South Africa soon in December, where I'm working on a soundscape for a hotel for the lift. So there's a point where I want to document that, so then I'll just put another record out. But yeah, it's a continuing journey.
And have you composed anything for David's building, the African, get the name wrong, I say it wrong every time.
Yes, it's a long
African American Museum, National Museum for African American Culture and History, opening in Washington this month. Are you going to are you going to create a composition for it?
I'm going to. I haven't got the commission yet, but I'm going to make one anyway, and then get the commission afterwards. But David's opening a museum next week on the 24th of September with President Obama. It's one of the last official things he'll do as his presidency, and it's next to the White House. It's the Museum of African American History and Culture, and it's a crowning glory of the Afro-American dream. It's 100 years since they gave a piece of land next to the White House for Afro-Americans to write their history in 1915, and they finally have completed it. David got the commission 10 years ago, and it opens next week. I'm going to Washington with him, and very exciting.
Do you have any sense in your head of what you would like to create for it?
Again, he's created many different spaces. Most of the museums are underground. When you see the space, it's based on a triple crown of a Yoruba king. That was his influence. But most of the museum is actually underground. There's a last space which he calls it's kind of a meditative space with a hole in the ceiling and a waterfall coming through. And it's where you finish the journey of going through the whole museum. So again, it's that journey thing. We were talking about this. I like the idea of spaces between spaces, not just the exhibition, but how you get to the next space, what's in between there. So David really describes the journey, how you start, you see the artifacts, and then you finish with something which is not the exhibits, but it's something to make you meditate and just sort of give you time to think about what you've seen. I want that space. So I want to create a kind of soundscape for that space. I told him yesterday, actually. He goes, that's a good idea. As long as Quincy Jones doesn't want to do it.
And would you ever do pieces for other people's architecture? So you mentioned a hotel, but would you be interested, if I had an amazing house that I wanted to commission something for, would you do it?
I'm ready, Malaika, yes.
Sadly, my tiny little London flat wouldn't inspire anything.
We can convert that into something amazing. Small is good. It's London. Yes, no, I think it's a whole new area, isn't it? Bespoke soundtracks for people's houses. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, I mean, you can commission a sculpture. Why not a piece of music?
A piece of music, yeah. It envelopes your house, which is all about who you are and what you're about. Yeah, very personalized. Music is very personal. I like the arts, yeah. And he just asked me, I'll give my card. Brilliant. Yeah.
Should we open
Any
it up?
questions that people would like to? Definitely, definitely. I'm all about sound. I'd love to do something to do with theatre and movement. Definitely, because I think the way we think about music, it's all about clubs or I guess those aspects, or maybe film is obviously a massive one, but theatre is also very important. Sound is everywhere, right? A film without sound is not going to really happen, and a lot of dance has to have sound, really, doesn't it? Something to dance to. I'd love to. If you've got a commission for me, let me know. I'm more into the conceptual artists and installations. So I'm more into doing kind of installations and working with other artists, whether it's an architect. I've worked with paintings. I've worked with different musicians, obviously. But one of the things I did was respond to a Liechtenstein painting for the Tate Modern, for the retrospective of the Liechtenstein exhibition. I took a painting and I did a 7.1 surround sound soundscape for the East Tank, and the idea was that you were kind of inside the painting, but we also had a group of architects helping people to construct the painting in 3D space while you listen to the soundtrack. So it's supposed to be kind of immersive and being in the space. So from 2D to 3D, it's yeah, I can do it. Yes. Oh my gosh, that's a good question. I'm in trouble. I didn't make those videos. That's a good. I could tell, actually. I knew I was in trouble. There's a really good film editor who made those videos. I actually think he's really quite interesting. It's very artistic in the way he approaches. I mean, to bring a building to kind of a life. So the question was, how involved am I in the editing? Oh, that's a great question again. I normally will respond to the visual, whether it's the architecture, the drawing, or the film, or this. So, and then I'll get it. I'll get a post-production. I'll get it back, and then it might be an edit to make it more seamless and add some found sound or some, sound effects and things like that. But I definitely want. I haven't really had somebody make a piece for my piece of music. And that's really what I want to do next, actually. Thank you for reminding me.
Those films were made quite a long time ago, weren't they?
Yeah, they were actually, it's interesting. Actually, those films have never been seen by anybody, by the way. If David knew I was showing them, he'd kill me. Really, they haven't been seen. I mean, you just seen inside someone's house there, right? That's kind of private. Anyway.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, sorry, Tim. Basically, when David finishes a piece of architecture, he has it filmed before it gets too cluttered as a way of archiving and preserving his original vision. It's a really interesting way of an architect sort of, and also getting somebody who actually makes films in that way. For me, they are musical sound journeys. They're particular. You're very right. The videos are very particular. They're not just thrown together. They are musical sound journeys through the spaces from beginning to end. That's what they are. They're in themselves something else. It's another release, if you like. Yeah, but yeah. It's an ever loop, isn't it? Visuals and sound, so yeah.
Anyone else?
Yes. Oh, he's got me there. As soon as you were saying that, I was thinking of the Gherkin. Have you been up the top? Have you been to the top of the Gherkin? The acoustics are terrible. The glass just echoes so badly that if we were talking, you wouldn't be able to hear me. Now they wanted to start. They wanted to have a jazz club there, but they couldn't because the acoustics are so bad. But the view's amazing. The visuals are incredible, but the architect didn't quite. I don't think it didn't really think about the acoustics. It was more about the aesthetic. So it goes back to the idea of the visual and not the acoustics. If a space doesn't feel, comfortable, you won't linger very long. You won't stay very long. So back to the elevator music. Okay, why would you stay in the elevator? I love elevators, actually. It's a really good question. Oh, elevator music. Terrible phrase, isn't it? Elevator music.
You wouldn't really want to be known for creating elevator music, though, would you?
No, I just, the word is terrible, isn't it? So what was the question about elevator music? It was, yeah, I do. I really do. Because it's background, but it's just wrong, isn't it? Elevator music. It needs to be more thought out. So yeah, when hotels are making spaces, I'm doing something for a hotel. I think every space, including every room, should have its own sound. Thematic in terms of architecture, design, and sound. Even a selection of sounds. I'm sure Greg agrees with me. Absolutely. Selection of records, its own aesthetic. When you go into the bathroom, there's a sound. When you go into, when you go into, the bedroom, there's a sound, and you can switch it off. But elevator music is not. Yeah, I prefer music that's engaging, emotive, makes you feel something. Yeah, so it has to take you somewhere. Yeah, thank you.
Actually,
Yes.
I phoned a British guest the other day and had some wonderful music while I was waiting.
It wasn't my music, was it?
That'd be lovely.
Yes. No, that particular project was completely interactive and bespoke, so I was there. And good point, though. We had to make a model of it before it was created. So I had the idea, the concept from David, and then we created a smaller version of that space, that Nobel field in England, to test how it would sound. But ultimately, I didn't know how it would sound with 100 different sensors, with different people walking around with 18 speakers, till we were actually interacting with the space. But we made a smaller version of it. And I remember something really beautiful, actually. Wangari Maathai, the lady who won, was in the space when I was walking around, because she'd just won. And she said to me that being in the space and the sounds that she heard and the kind of Nobel field made her feel as if she was in a home in the village where she came from. So although the sound's electronic, I'm really into quite, natural kind of sort of feeling. It's kind of electronic, but it's very emotive. It felt very natural. It felt like the stream in there for her, and it felt like she was outdoors in this beautiful space. So that was a really beautiful comment that she gave me. But yeah, definitely there, and we tested it many times before we went out there. It wasn't made for that film. But afterwards, after the film was made, I then recomposed the sound installation for that film. I took different parts of the composition and I mapped it kind of to that film. So you've got me there. those sounds you've heard, they're not exactly what you heard in the installation. I've made a kind of edit. So the first one, it was an edit, a 3-minute edit of something that lasts all day. The Nobel is something that lasts all day for the last 10 years. It doesn't sound always like that, but I took little bits to make that visual. So it's those sounds, but not necessarily in that way. But it kind of feels that way. Yeah. So there's different. I mean, I'm getting into this idea of making many different versions of what I do, and realizing that it's okay because you can't listen to an installation music; it's a bit boring. But on a record, it's not installation music. It's 4-minute pieces which you can pretty much digest. Because I think that'll be quite elevator if it was just back to, yeah, loops. Exactly, you're right. Because they have to last for a very long time. Whereas this is a 1-hour album, so I kind of remade all the music for listening purposes and the film.